good to talk about it. Oh, I love the 60s. Well, what was so wonderful about the 60s? The 60s, we had some of the most prominent, wonderful people in the world killed. We had Vietnam. What was so wonderful? You got to smoke grass? What was so wonderful about the 60s?
60s were good for America. I know some of the pressure cooker that existed. That conformity was dangerous. That Cold War conformity. The 60s really started to question these things.
The 60s said you can be anything you want to be. You can go out and have free sex, you can go out and have free drugs, you can go out and not have to fight battles and stay free people. You can have free, free, free.
I certainly think there were excesses in the 60s. Now, if America thought we could get out of racism in a nice, measured way, could overturn segregation and without some excesses, then I think it underestimated the force and effect of segregation.
People have been lied to about everything. All right, we've been lied to about everything, we're gonna have to test everything. And we did some pretty stupid things.
I took a hit of Osley White Lightning acid, and I became an instant hippie. Instantly, because of that acid.
These kids got nothing to do but run around the streets and then go home and have a lot of free love and smoke dope. Here I am, you know, scratching my head wondering how I'm gonna pay both the light bill and the gas bill this month. You know, because I've got 4 kids, all you can do is walk around the street in sandals.
They would always say, go slow and do it decorously. There was always this sense of great politeness and decorousness, and you must understand that we felt dropping carpet bombings on people was not very decorous.
I was at Wisconsin when some students bombed one of the buildings, and I said, let's go down to the student union, and I will bet you $50 that within 5 minutes, we will be able to find someone who will argue that that kid deserved to die because he was in that building. And I won that $50.
We meant to be intolerable. America and the American people were intolerable to us, and we were in opposition to them, and we meant to annoy them, and we meant to get them angry, and we meant to confront them.
We should have done more. We should have valued the time. There were a lot of mistakes made that, you know, if we'd known what we were doing, we wouldn't have made them.
The 60s will never level out. Maybe it's just that in every 60s decade, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, we have to go through some crisis like this. But there was certainly that we had us a time, and we're still trying to figure out what it was all about.
The 1960s was the most tumultuous, confusing, and controversial decade of the 20th century. It still inspires passionate debate. But there's no debate about this. The 1960s was an era of rebellion. Most of those who rebelled were young. And although they were a minority of their generation, their numbers were sufficient, their beliefs so strong, and their behavior so challenging that many mainstream Americans saw them as a significant threat to the nation's morals, manners, and values. The result was a period of almost continuous conflict. Making sense of all this is very much a matter of understanding who rebelled, what triggered their rebellions, how the rest of the country reacted to them, and what happened to America as a result. These young people didn't suddenly begin to rebel at the stroke of midnight on January 1st, 1960. The seeds of the 60s were planted earlier. And the first of these seeds was an enormous increase in the American birth rate that began in 1946, known as the baby boom. By the 60s, their sheer numbers, 76 million in all, would give this generation unprecedented power and influence.
Those of us who brought the baby boom into being, the returning World War II veterans,
we didn't know what the hell we were doing. I mean, we really didn't know. We all came home and we all had children. There was no advice, really. Dr. Spock had a book out, but we didn't know anything about child rearing. In other words, let me try to say it this way. There were certain things that you just did.
Today is a high point in the romance of Bob and Mary. For them, the future looks bright.
We didn't know anything about relationships, communication between husband and wife. There was very little communication. Children, child rearing, how do you raise children? No one knew. In other words, it was supposed just to happen.
George Leonard and other members of his generation may not have known how to raise their children, but they did know that they wanted to protect them from the tough times they had experienced.
The parents of the 1950s were, I think, the most unusual generation of the 20th century. These are the people who had grown up in the Depression. They had experienced real tough times when they were children and when they were teenagers. And then World War II hit, as many of them were just reaching adulthood, and they had the trauma of the war. And then, after all that, they reached the 1950s at a time when the U.S. was tremendously prosperous, when the economy was booming as we've never seen it before. And I think they reacted to that prosperity, and I think they reacted strongly to all of the trauma of the Depression and the war by turning inward a bit, by marrying young, by emphasizing home and family, as if that was something they couldn't get back in the 30s and 40s and now valued all the more.
And this is Levittown. Here you can own your own home, complete with its own refrigerator, television set, and clothes dryer. You can raise your children far from the city's dirt, crowding, and crime, in comfort and safety.
Growing up in the suburbs, nearly 70% of white middle-class baby boomers spent their childhoods in these totally new communities. For these young people and their older brothers and sisters, this environment would have an enormous impact on how they would behave in the 60s.
It was a perfect setting in which the youth culture, in a certain sense, could blossom. Life in the suburbs was organized around the kids again. They were the center of attention, endless round of Little League games and PTA meetings, etc. So it was in the suburbs, in a certain sense, that this message about the importance and the uniqueness and the generational potency associated with these kids, I think, was delivered with real force.
In the average American family today, children are the object of more concentrated thought and concern than the young of any previous generation. For out of an increasing understanding of child psychology has come an awareness that children are real people with individual personalities which must be respected and encouraged.
This was a distinctly new way to be raised in the world. And it allowed for a whole generation that I suppose we would now call spoiled kids, which from another point of view simply meant kids who had very high expectations in life with respect to freedom and happiness. They thought life was about being free and about being happy. And they carried those expectations forward into high school and into college, and brought with them a kind of a level of expectation that was simply unprecedented in, I would say, in world history.
These kids felt no worries about money. But their parents grew up at a time when insecurity was a fact of life and deprivation a daily experience. They could never quite convince themselves their escape from poverty was permanent.
We found out in the 50s that if you got up in the morning and went to work and did a good day's work, that things got better. You got promoted or you got more money, you were able to buy furniture, you could have more children, the children could have better clothes, and life just improved. We knew it was because you went to work. But I'm not sure our children realized that. They saw simply that the clothes got better, the house got bigger, the neighborhood got nicer. And I have a strong suspicion that what happened in the late 60s was that the kids who rebelled took it for granted that life would improve automatically.
Now here's a major seed of the 60s. Because of their profoundly different life experiences, kids had trouble understanding why their fathers worked so hard. The way many of them saw it, Their fathers were engaging in the single-minded pursuit of material comforts.
My dad was always above board in all his business dealings, but I would say money and getting ahead and making a lot of bucks was his goal. And I think what it was Dad meant well. Dad wanted to love us, but Dad was so busy at work. He would work till 2, 3 in the morning doing artwork for the business. He'd get up early and be gone. I hardly ever saw him.
Everything young boys saw at home and on TV told them that if they did as they were supposed to, they would be, quote, lucky enough to follow in their father's footsteps.
The Cub Scout program helps the boys' adjustment both to the family and to the group.
This son of yours has been fighting again. Look at this shirt. Can I tell you about it, Pop? Look, he's proud of it. Please, Pop.
Not now, Jerry. I'm tired. I had a
Mike
bad
Kelly
day.
said you didn't have the guts to stand up for yourself, so I took a poke at him. That was all right, wasn't it? Mike.
What TV showed you was a world in which men were essentially impotent.
He didn't have any right to say that about you, did he, Pop? Go to your room and get a decent shirt. This minute. Did he, Pop?
There were no chance for risk. There was no place for excitement. There was no place for no challenges being offered whatsoever. And the other kind of show you could watch were the Westerns, which showed what a real man could do, measuring himself against other men, especially with a gun. And I think that anybody who was a red-blooded American boy in the 1950s knew that they wanted to be more like Matt Dillon or more like the paid gunfighter in Have Gun Will Travel than they wanted to be Beaver Cleaver's father.
Isn't it wonderful how this washer does all these heavy things?
And what did girls feel was in store for them? A life just like their mothers.
Judy, it isn't as bad as all that, dear.
Sorry, Mother. I was just thinking.
About what?
Well, you know, thinking how awful wash day used to be for you before you had the electric water heater and the washer.
So now I add the pectin.
Educational films like this one reflect society's belief that women could find fulfillment only as housewives and mothers.
Now I let it come to a full rolling boil again. It won't take long. You like to cook, don't you, Pat? Oh, it's not just liking to cook. It's more. It's accomplishing something. It's me cooking. Me, Susan Douglas. And not just cooking, but, well, creating something special. Oh, I wish Miss Holland could talk to you. She could say it so much better than I can. Who's Miss Holland? She's my home economics teacher.
Not enough of anyone means soup instead of jelly.
Even girls who were sent to college often majored in what were called the domestic sciences.
Well, there's one nice thing about it happening in class. Here it's part of our learning. At home it would be a minor tragedy.
There was a song when I went to college, at Smith College, which they don't sing anymore, I know, that had a verse that went something like this. You're sharp as a pinpoint, your grades are really 10-point. You are Dean's List Sophia Smith. But when a man wants a kiss kid, he doesn't want a quiz kid. Oh, you can't get a man with your brains, with your brains, with your brains. Oh, you can't get a man with your brains. And it had verses that went on and on. Now, I sang that in 1957 with a sense of how true it was and how funny it was. Now, of course, it makes a shiver run up and down my spine.
I had 4 choices of things that I could be when I grew up. I could be a teacher, a nurse, a stewardess, or a secretary. I couldn't go into things that dealt with medicine. I couldn't go into law. I couldn't go into the real professions. It was extremely limiting. And of course, the overall goal was to find a husband, get married, have children, and live with a white picket fence.
I used to make little stews for my child and he used to spit them out and stick them on the wall, but I went on doing it. I don't know why. Dr. Spock. I think Dr. Spock ruined everything. I really do. I mean, he's wonderful in the peace movement. But this whole image of giving your children everything you had, and they have to be satisfied and they have to be content, and I think we gave them much too much.
The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, starring the entire Nelson family. Here's Ozzie. Here's Harriet.
And here it is, the American family of the 1950s, as it was seen thousands of evenings on TV. Happy kids, happy father, happy mother. Everyone behaving as they were supposed to.
You know, it's none of my business, but don't you think taking riding lessons is a pretty expensive way to meet a girl?
The message was absolutely unmistakable. This was the way your life should be. And if it wasn't, something must be very wrong.
Everyone watched Ozzie and Harriet and assumed that everyone they knew lived that life. And then they went around pretending that they lived it too. But no one really did. Even Ozzie and Harriet didn't. So on some level, there's been a myth all along. And part of the plague of the 50s was the incredible personal efforts, the incredible pain involved in perpetuating that myth about one's own family, about one's own happiness in that family, about the health of that family.
They saw women as feeling very discontented. They saw husbands feel pressured, harried by the demands of their jobs and families, and they saw children as feeling extremely alienated. So clearly, I think many of the roots of the 60s explosions were planted in the supposedly placid family of the 1950s.
This boy and girl coming home from school look quite content with life. They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family.
Though they seem artificial today, educational films like this one, which were shown to school children all over America, accurately reflect the attitudes and values of white middle-class society in the 1950s, when real-life documentaries were few and far between.
Doesn't that sound exciting to you?
Their purpose was to teach kids the proper way to behave, and to repeat and reinforce a set of rules.
The rules were things you talked about on the telephone with your friends, and they were imposed by your parents. Parents talked about it a lot. There were high school counselors who told you what the rules were, and even if they weren't written down, everybody really knew, and you could almost read them out, cite them. And I think looking back on it from the 60s, what people did in the 60s was self-consciously break every damn one of them.
The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time. Brother notices the time and realizes that he must put things in order and clean himself up in time for dinner.
What were the rules? One of them was obey authority. Don't ask questions. In the 60s, millions of young people would renounce that one.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad.
We are molding our boys the way we feel they should be molded in the 50s. I think you have to start molding right away when they're just infants. And so that was our influence. We tried to make this a very influential time, a constructive time, through Boy Scouts, through church, through Cub Scouts, through Little League, or not Little League, but the little pony leagues or whatever they had, you know, these little kids. It was awfully cute. Yeah, they were fun times with our kids, with our boys. We had a great time.
Let father and mother guide the conversational trend if they desire. After all, they made all this possible.
My impression of that time was that a child was to be seen and not heard, and that we were never allowed to express anything that was negative. We were never allowed to talk back in any way
even to question why should I do something or could I do it later. We weren't treated as if we were people. We were another species.
Another rule, control your emotions. In the 60s, masses of baby boomers would reverse this one and, quote, let it all hang out.
Oh, I'm so happy. I could be a model. Or a cover girl.
Hey, what's gotten into that crazy kid's sister?
Oh, Jeff, don't be that way.
Notice how Mother seems to become angry herself because of Jeff's anger. Perhaps she shouldn't, but anger is a violent emotion, and we often see an induction of behavior or spread of emotion to other persons, almost like a contagious disease.
If you misbehaved, you weren't normal. And the idea of normal is a kind of vegetative state where nothing happens. But that's what everybody tried to aspire to. But I think it's a word that people are constantly using to exhort you to behave better. Why don't you be normal? It's not normal to wear your hair long. It's not normal to wear Levi's. It's not normal to listen to rock and roll. It's not normal to read comic books. There's a whole list of a million things that everybody does that isn't normal.
Well, what makes you think they look at your clothes?
Oh, because the other fellas wear sweaters or just shirts, not a regular suit like mine.
Well, wear a sweater then.
Another rule, fit in with the group. Don't stand out. Conform in your actions and your appearance. In the 60s, great numbers of young people would, quote, do their own thing.
Pick out the most popular boys and girls in school and keep an eye on them. Try to figure out why people like them. Not that you'll ever be just like any of them, but you might learn something. Well, see you there.
Many young people found these restrictions painfully repressive, but they struggled to obey them anyhow because if they didn't, they knew there'd be unpleasant consequences from society or from their peers.
Yoo-hoo!
Jenny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Jenny out, he learns that she dates all the boys. What about Jenny? Does that make her really popular? Do the boys and girls like her? Is she welcome to join this group?
Hi, Betty. Ellie. You can rest your tray here, Jenny, for a minute. Thanks. Say, Wally, how's the play coming along?
Oh, okay, Jenny. Here, Jenny.
No,
Thanks,
girls
Jerry.
who park in cars are not really popular. Not even with the boys they park with. Not when they meet at school or elsewhere.
Nothing like being Miss Popularity.
Yeah.
I think that there was this sense that, yeah, well, sure, they're using sex to be popular now, but, you know, what about in the future? They're going to be, like, thrown in the rubbish pile. And I think that did happen because I think that boys did maintain an attitude of, you know, they wanted to get laid, but they wanted to marry a virgin.
Jeff, isn't that Eileen?
It sure is. Baby and all.
Gee, I haven't seen her since she left school.
And maybe this was the biggest rule of all. Don't even think about having sex. In the 60s, young people all over the country would proclaim, if it feels good, do it.
Mary, wait, please. Sorry, Mary.
In the height of emotion, it's not always easy to stop and think things through. But if you'll just slow down the rush and pressure of your feelings a little, then judgment has a better chance to take hold and guide you away from wrong behavior.
It was sort of a nightmare. Looking from the outside, I'm sure it didn't seem that way to observer, but for me, I felt so lonely. I was popular, and I didn't have those problems. I wasn't a nerd or anything like that, but there just wasn't anybody from my planet, is the way that I kind of described it. I felt like I had so much bottled up inside of me.
Most kids trying to behave properly did keep it all bottled up inside, but a minuscule number began to rebel. It was a preview of coming attractions.
What startles me when I look back at my yearbook photos now, they all look so old. Everybody looks so old. I mean, they look like little adults, you know. They don't, it's startling to me how old, how already getting into the groove all of these people look with their flat top crew cuts. And then ever so often, you know, you turn the page and you see the guy with the ducktail. And you know, here's the rebel.
Being a rebel by slicking your hair back and wearing a black leather jacket seems harmless now. But in the 1950s, many adults saw this as the first sign of teenagers going bad.
Many teenagers are as concerned as their parents with the public's conception of today's youth. These students are portraying what we consider bad taste in school attire and behavior. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt.
Improper dress was an innocent way to defy adult restrictions, but a growing number of young people were turning against society's rules in more significant ways.